On Christmas Eve, 1945, it was just another ordinary winter evening in the town of Fayetteville, West Virginia. But that night would mark the beginning of one of the most mysterious disappearances in American history. A family, 5 missing children, and dozens of unanswered questions. As you listen to this story, keep one thing in mind. Sometimes a fire leaves behind not just ashes, but a great mystery as well. December 24th, 1945, Fayetteville, West Virginia. That night, the Sodder family home was full. The older sons had washed the trucks during the day, while the younger ones stared at the gifts laid out under the tree. George had made his final delivery that day, and Jenny had left the Christmas cookies to cool in the kitchen. There were 10 children in the house. When the older ones went to bed, the younger 5, Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., and Betty insisted on staying up a little longer. "Don't forget to turn off the lights," said Jenny. "We'll be up early in the morning." It was 11:50 p.m. George closed the stove lid, locked the front door, and put out his cigarette. At 12:30 a.m., the phone rang. Jenny, half asleep, picked up the receiver. There was a noisy background, laughter, clinking glasses, ... The woman asked for someone who wasn't home. Jenny said wrong number and hung up. She wasn't at ease. She went down to the living room. The lights were on, the curtains were open, the door chain was missing. The little ones must have left the cookies and gone upstairs. She turned off the lights, drew the curtains, and checked the door a minute or two later. There was a sound of something rolling off the roof. Clunk, clunk, clunk. Then silence. "It's the wind," he thought. Then the air changed. The smell of burnt insulation and wood filled the stairwell. Jenny jumped up. Orange glow was rising near the fuse box. The ceiling beams were darkening. George jolted awake, roused the older children. The 2 little ones were scooped up and carried out the door. But the 5 upstairs were behind their bedrooms. The bottom steps of the staircase caught fire, flames spreading to the body in seconds. George ran to the long ladder in the garden. To reach the window, the ladder was always in the same place. It was gone. The water barrels were frozen. "I'll pull the truck over," he said. He turned the ignition. The engine wouldn't start. The other truck kit was silent too. Both vehicles failing to start at the same time. From that moment on, the file, ... The neighbor ran through the snow in his nightclothes. "I'm calling the fire department." The town's fire department was made up of volunteers. It took time for them to gather at this hour of the night. The flames reduced the house to a skeleton in less than 2 hours. The creaking sound from the beam as a wall collapsed emptied everyone in the garden of their senses. George didn't feel the snow under his bare feet. He had only one question in his mind. How do I get to the window? Asterisk, in the first gray light of dawn, the wreckage began to cool. George raked through the ash mounds with his hands along the stone foundation. A strand of hair, a button, a hairpin. "Nothing," the fire chief said. "The heat may have destroyed everything," George asked, without looking up everything. House fires weren't crematoriums. Teeth, bones, metal, something would remain. Nothing had. The official, initial explanation was electrical failure. But Jenny kept saying that as the flames rose, the Christmas tree lights continued to burn. If a short circuit had been the main cause, the lights would have gone out instantly. The next morning, a line worker climbed the pole and saw this. The telephone line was cut off before it reached the house. "The fire couldn't have started before the wire," he said. This implied that someone had intervened from outside. The ladder was found 2 days later in a ditch far from the house. Who had carried it there and left it? The answer to the noise on the roof came a day later. A black, spongy, hollow piece of rubber was found behind the house. An old soldier whispered, "It looks like the fused body of an aerial grenade." The official report didn't include this, but it stuck in Jenny's mind. When she thought about the wind hitting the slope, the glint on the window that night, and the tap tap together, there was only one sentence in her mind. Something was thrown onto the roof. Each rescue attempt now seems like a sign in hindsight. The ladder disappearing, the water barrels freezing, 2 trucks failing at once. Was it a chain of coincidences or someone's plan? George was inclined to say plan. Jenny didn't want to say the word coincidence. "We need an explanation," she said. As morning progressed, people gathered around the house. Volunteers shoveled ash, soil, snow, and charred wood were sifted through. A flat metal plate was found. It was the stove's lid. They searched for another hour. The result was the same. When the fire chief said no bone fragments were found, Jenny's face showed only one expression: disbelief. After that day, she set up a small experiment in the kitchen. She burned pieces of meat and bone in an ash pan for hours. Result: the bones were still there. Then she looked up a crematorium. House fire temperatures ... Rumors spread quickly around town. On Christmas morning, a woman at the gas station said she saw 5 children in a car. There was a man speaking Italian with them. The next day, a restaurant waiter mentioned 4 quiet children and 2 adults weren't allowed to speak. Hotel employees seemed to recall a group arriving at night with 2 unidentified adults and several children. The times and locations of these reports didn't always match up. Some details remained eerily consistent. The children ... asterisk, asterisk. "These are rumors," said one of the officials. "There is no evidence." The case seemed to be closing with a few sentences. Electrical malfunction, reasonable loss. Nothing was closed for George and Jenny. Days after the fire, George found another piece of rubber on the back slope of the house. It left an impression when squeezed. "Make a note of this," he said. No one did. That evening, he dug up the ground beneath the pole where the phone line had been cut. He searched for clues, found none. The following week, a large billboard rose on the road in front of the house. Photos of 5 children, a promise of reward written below, and a single question: "Have you seen them?" The billboard weathered years of rain, snow, and sun. George swept beneath it in the mornings. Jenny hung new posters on it. Passers-by stopped and looked. The billboard showed that one family had not given up. While the town was divided, those who said, "Let it go," and those who said, "Something happened." Shortly after the fire chief made an unexpected confession. "I buried a box," he said. "I thought it was a heart." The box was exhumed. An expert examined the piece that came out. Unburned cow liver. "Why?" asked George. The chief's answer was unclear. This added another strange note to the file, and no one shed any light on it. Asterisk: after confirming that the house's phone line had been cut, Jenny prepared a timeline going back hour by hour. 0:30 phone, 0:40 noise on the roof. 0:45 smell, 0:48 flames. First the phone was cut, then something fell on the roof. Then the fire started, the timeline stated. George also made his own timeline. The ladder was there in the afternoon. After midnight it was gone. Someone must have moved it. They couldn't find a plausible explanation for why 2 trucks weren't working that same night. The engines started easily in the morning. The fuel line froze. ... Up to this point, the language of the official reports clashed with the reality. In front of the house, the report said electrical failure. Christmas lights were burning during the fire. The report said high heat. There were no bones at the scene. The report said notified. Volunteers gathered at the scene hours later. This conflict pushed the family not into silence, but rather into talking more. George drove his truck to nearby towns and distributed flyers. Jenny wrote down every tip that came in. Letters, phone calls, anonymous envelopes, and postcards ... Asterisk one day. A photo of a young man arrived in the mailbox. Written on the back in shaky letters was a single sentence: "Louis Sodder, your brother loves you." Louis was 9 years old. When he disappeared in the photo, he appeared to be in his 20s. The openness of his eyes, the curve of his lips. "It could be him," said Jenny. George was cautious, but he hired a private investigator nonetheless. The detective was going to Kentucky. He went and never returned. Whether he came back, who he asked, what he saw, none of it was recorded. He was either a con man or someone. ... As the investigation progressed, the question of why was always on the table. If this wasn't an accident, What was the motive? Revenge? Political animosity? Child trafficking? The war had just ended. People were displaced. Records were weak. Borders were porous. It was a climate ripe for evil. But that required evidence beyond conjecture. In this first part, set the stage for the evidence and oddities. The cut phone line, the noise heard on the roof, and the rubber piece found, the missing staircase, the trucks that fell silent at the same time, a fire that left no bones, conflicting official statements, and corroborating witness reports. In the second part, we'll shift the focus and trace each of these details individually. Why do the fire dynamics contradict the crematorium? Data. Why is the point where the line was cut critical? What do the stairs and trucks tell us? BENWOOD ... We will open a map. We'll place the date-time schedules side by side. We will show where the witness statements overlap and where they diverge. But before moving on to the second part, let us note one last detail. Jenny had the same dream. Over and over again, months after the fire. The dream the house was not burning. A light shone through the window of the upstairs room, and 5 children turned their heads one by one to look outside. A shadow passed behind them, and someone put a finger to their lips and said, "She." Each time, Jenny would startle awake in her bed, ... when the second part begins. There will be 3 things on the table: a magnifying glass, a timeline, and 5 photos on the board. The rest of the story will be based on these 3 things. The family's first goal was to clarify the hours of the night. Jenny said that everything was normal at home before the wrong call at 12:30 a.m., that the little ones were laughing as they went upstairs from the living room. Around 12:40 a.m., the sound on the roof. 12:45 a.m., the smell. 12:48 a.m., the appearance of flames in the stairwell. The eldest son, John, explained that he tried to wake his siblings, but the smoke made it nearly impossible. George repeated the ladder was always hanging on the south wall. It wasn't there that night. This meant that someone had removed it during the day, or that everyone ... The telephone line inspection revealed a separate issue. The line running from the pole to the house had been cut at a point outside the house. There were no burn marks. The line had been cut and hung down. This indicated an intervention unaffected by the fire. When the line was cut, calls could not be made from the house. However, the wrong number call received during the night showed that the line was still working. This meant that the interruption had occurred sometime after the wrong number call. This distinction was critical in determining the sequence of events. The delay of the fire department was related to the structure of the town. Volunteers struggled. To gather at midnight, no driver could be found. According to one claim, the team leader did not know how to drive, and they waited for another driver. By the time the fire was extinguished, the house had already collapsed. This made gathering evidence difficult from the outset. The wreckage was controlled mostly with snow and shovels, not water. The absence of remains pushed the family to work scientific avenues. Jenny kept asking about the burning behavior of bones. Crematorium officials said, "Soft tissues go quickly, but bone tissue doesn't completely turn to dust. It remains and is ground down." A forensic expert added, "House fires are irregular. The temperature is not the same everywhere. It can reach 900 degrees Celsius in one place and remain at 400 degrees Celsius in another corner. It is not expected that so many people would be completely destroyed." These words widened the gap with the official report. George couldn't get it out of his head. The trucks weren't working at the same time. The engines had started without any problems that morning. "Someone messed with the starter relay," said one mechanic. "The cable might have come loose." Another said, "If the fuel line is clogged, it'll start when the frost melts overnight." But for both trucks to have the same problem, at the same time, on the same night, that was recorded in the statistics as a low probability event. A staircase from the house was found 2 days later, quite far from the house, in a ditch. Someone must have carried it there and thrown it away. But who? Someone had seen a black sedan passing in front of the house that night. The license plate number couldn't be read. A neighbor said. There was a man who had been hanging around the house for days, saying he was an insurance salesman. George had already reported to the police that this person had yelled at him a week before the fire. "Your house will be reduced to ashes. Your children will be gone." After the incident, the man disappeared. At the end of the first week, the family sifted through the ashes under the house as if using a sieve. Nails, glass shards, metal connectors were separated one by one. A professor considered an expert on the subject said, "If the bodies of 5 children had burned here, you would have at least found their teeth. Tooth enamel is among the most fire-resistant tissues. There was not a single tooth in the rubble." Asterisk the package the fire chief called the heart shook the family's confidence. Perhaps they were looking for some kind of closure. But the discovery of unburned beef liver cast a shadow over the seriousness of the investigation. After that day, the family listened to unofficial channels as much as official ones. A priest, a teacher, a truck driver, everyone had something to say. Some were inconsistent. Some were heartbreakingly meaningful. The Sodders were not alone. There were people in town who believed them, who went door to door seeking help. But in small places, secrets travel fast too. One woman said, "I saw the children in a house in Charleston." Another wrote in a letter, "My relative in Ohio said she saw 4 children with 2 adults in a restaurant." These reports sent the family out on the road each time. Several times, doors remained closed. Once, a door opened, but those inside did not speak. The photograph that would arrive years later was not the first glimmer of hope, but it became the most enduring one. The gaze of the young man in the photo left in the mailbox resembled Louise's gaze. There were also some difficult-to-understand additions on the note behind it. We will put these details on the table in the second part, because such notes create the most dangerous zone, oscillating between false leads and real clues. Asterisk. Now let's go back and focus on the first 72 hours. On the morning of December 25th, the area around the house was like an unsecured crime scene. Neighbors, onlookers, wishers, ... Everyone thought they had found something. This led to the evidence being contaminated. In the afternoon, volunteers dug a trench along the foundation, thinking maybe there are remains under the rubble. There weren't. That same day, a utility worker reported a cut wire. The next day, the ladder was found. On the third day, a piece of rubber on the back slope. This chronology seems more like a chain than a coincidence. Another critical question: if someone targeted this house, why? George's political statements, insurance issues, business competition, ethnic tensions, all were written into the file as possibilities. But there was no direct measurable evidence for any of them. This uncertainty kept the story open for years. The family's emotional world also became part of the file. Jenny continued to have the same dream at night, a light shining on the window. 5 silhouettes, a finger brought to the lips. George stood in front of the board at night and said his children's names one by one: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty. Some called it a denial mechanism, but for the family, it was resistance. Dozens of letters, dozens of reports, dozens of false hopes, ... Some of them will be classified one by one in the second part. Date, place, narrator, consistency, asterisk, another technical detail. Smoke and heat flow in a house fire. The hot smoke rising like a chimney to the upper floor as the staircase caught fire may have caused the children to lose consciousness within minutes. Note that this does not explain the fact of the missing remains, but it partially explains the phenomenon of no sound. Such scientific details take the story away from sensationalism and bring it closer to reality. The file also contained the insurance insistence and threatening words of a man who came to the house a few days before the fire. The man said, "If you don't get insurance, you'll be in trouble." George called the police but could not give the man's name. This person was never seen again. There was also an electrician who declared the house's wiring dangerous. George said he had just had the wiring redone. These 2 visits went into the warnings folder prior to the fire. Asterisk, during this process, an appeal was also made to federal authorities. George wrote a letter to the FBI requesting their assistance due to the possibility of kidnapping. The response: signed by J. Edgar Hoover, was polite but conditional. We cannot intervene without a request from local authorities. Fayette County said no need. The case remained on the shelf at the official level as a local fire incident. At the unofficial level, however, it became a nationwide missing persons case. Over the years, the family rebuilt the house. But it was not the same house. One room in the new house was always left empty, in case they returned. 2 chairs were placed in front of the window. Jenny would sit in one, George in the other, reading the letters aloud. The family hung on to every thread with the same discipline: date, place, time, consistency. Still, to be honest, counter-arguments were also produced for each of these anomalies. The wind may have broken the phone line. Someone may have dragged the ladder as a joke. The trucks froze. The fire was too hot. The morning after the fire was extinguished, the footsteps of people wandering around the house soon fell into the same rhythm. Step on the ashes. Stop, bend down, look, nothing there. This rhythm continued to echo in the town's mind for days. The sound of nothing is heard at first like a crackle. Then the ear grows accustomed to this silence and realizes that nothing actually signifies something. For George and Jenny, nothing was now proof. It was a trace louder than anything a fire left behind, the trace of absence. That first evening, George scanned the perimeter of the stone foundation again. He checked each nail head, each beam end, each reflection in the ash. Jenny thought. About the point where the black phone in the house had gone silent. They said the city line had come through solidly to the pole, but had been cut somewhere before reaching the house. It wasn't cut by the fire, said the line worker, like a knife. A night when the knife struck first and the flames rose after. The timeline was slowly falling into place. 12:30, wrong number. 12:40 something rolling on the roof. 12:45 smell of smoke. 12:48 flames. Each minute tightened like a rope around the word coincidence. Asterisk George's gaze was fixed on the same spot, the ladder. The long ladder that had been there for years, hung up so that people could reach the window, was gone that night. 2 days later, it was found in a ditch by the roadside, quite far from the house. Who moved it? When? Why? No one had seen anything. Some said maybe something was washed away in the rain. But there was no rain that night. The location of the ladder? The trucks not working that night, the water barrels freezing. 3 small disasters happening at the same time seemed like the sign of an amateurish plan or professional sabotage. George said, "These 3 things together can't be bad luck," Jenny whispered. "Whether I say it or not, my mind is there." They were both stuck on different points. But the threads converged at the same knot. The town began to talk. In front of a grocery store, someone said, "If they don't know how to handle electricity, they'll burn down." An old man coming out of church put his hand on Jenny's shoulder and said, "May God give you patience." An insurance salesman had argued with George days before the fire, shouting, "One day this house will be ashes." That statement ceased to be just a statement and became part of the plot. Half the town dismissed these words as drunken ramblings. The other half grumbled, "So someone wanted this fire?" Gossip isn't fed by evidence. It thrives on suspicion. Sometimes the only step toward the truth. Asterisk Jenny set up her own laboratory, the kitchen. She placed meat and small bone fragments in a large pan and burned them for hours. She wanted to see how the bone behaved, how it cracked, and which pieces remained after how long. The result made her cry. It remained. The children were there, ... Something should have remained, she said. Nothing remaining, ... double quotes. Words of grief are often left unfinished. Oh, George called the crematorium. Bones don't completely disappear at house fire temperatures, they said. It takes a very long time and very high heat. George's hands were shaking as he hung up the phone. He didn't want to be convinced. But a voice inside him was screaming, "Don't be convinced." The black, spongy piece he found on the slope behind the house further confused the town. An old soldier said, "We saw bombs like this in the army. They start the fire from the roof." As long as the official record said short circuit. This piece had no name. Without a name, it didn't go into the file. But on the family's table, The mark left by the black rubber took up more space than anything else. Asterisk days turned into weeks. The smell of the fire slowly dissipated, but the question continued to hang over the house like thick smoke. George had a billboard made, large enough for everyone using the road to see. It featured 5 photographs. Beneath them, in huge letters, was an appeal. If you saw it, heard it, know anything, please. He also had a reward promise written next to it. Those who came to the billboard prayed, shook their heads. Some fell silent, others said, "Let them give up now." The simplicity of this sentence only increased George's anger. "If I let go, I'll lose her a second time," he said. Jenny's silence was a sharper resistance. She didn't turn off the kitchen light. She waited in front of the door, which she left slightly ajar at night. Sometimes she thought she heard laughter coming from the wrong number. Wrong number was, perhaps, the first correct sign. Asterisk, multiple reports came in. A young man working at the gas station in town said, on Christmas morning, a car pulled up with 5 children inside. The man next to them was speaking another language. A restaurant waiter recounted the next day for children. And 2 adults ate quietly, a hotel clerk said. 2 people without ID, and the children stayed briefly at midnight. Some of these statements contradicted each other in terms of time and date. Others seemed to complement each other. The police said, "There's no concrete evidence," and closed the case. George opened a new page in his own notebook for every page the police closed. He wrote down the date, time, direction, and words spoken in the reports. He tried to trace even the slightest trace of a tone of voice. Even when he took seemingly unnecessary notes like, did his lips tremble when he said yes? Jenny would look at him for a long time and say, "This is how I survive," she said. "Otherwise I can't breathe." One of the town elders came to George. "Look, buddy, if this keeps up, everyone will turn on each other." He looked George in the eye. "Take down the board." George didn't laugh, shout, or fight back. "If I take it down," he said, "I'll be building a second wall over my children." As the shadow of the board lengthened, the town split in 2. "What a pity he's destroying himself," said some. ... "Something happened right before our eyes," grumbled others. ... Asterisk one day, a thin envelope fell into the mailbox. It had no name, no address. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his 20s. Jenny stood under the kitchen lamp, held the photo by the frame, and leaned forward. The openness of the eyes, the line of the lips, ... the lobe of the ear. "Louis," she said. "This ... could be Louis." On the back of the photograph were a few words and an incomprehensible series of numbers. George immediately went after a lead. A city name could be read from the postmark, but some of the letters were faded. A town in a nearby state. George hired a detective to go there. The detective set off. Days passed. No phone call came. He called someone else. He also went after it. "I'll call tomorrow," he said. Tomorrow never came. Detective returned. "Either we were scammed," said a neighbor, "or they were silenced," said George. Both sentences reopened the same wound. The road entered darkness somewhere and disappeared from view. At night, Jenny opened a small notebook in the kitchen. What I saw, what I heard, what I felt. Today, the woman standing in front of the bulletin board looked away, she noted. And maybe she was quick-tempered. Maybe she was scared. Maybe ... Her sentences often ended with 3 dots. The ellipsis represented what was still possible in Jenny's world. In George's notebook, however, the sentences ended more sharply. Stairs change of location, line disconnection. Trucks break down that same night. Sometimes they would place the 2 notebooks side by side and say, "We're writing the same thing in different languages. We're trying to reach the same thing." Asterisk official authorities were unwilling to write anything other than power failure. George wrote to higher authorities. "Help us open an investigation. It's outside our jurisdiction," came the reply. Another authority said, "You should call the local authorities." The local authorities were not called. The family tried legal avenues. The doors remained closed.
At a certain point,
the distance between what was official and what was real became harder to measure than the distance between 2 points on the town map. George said, If you take us off the paper, the truth will escape too. They continued to write, apply, and report in order to remain on the paper. In the intervening months, another oddity emerged. The fire chief said, "I buried something. I thought it was a heart." The expert who examined the piece taken from the box said, "It's cow liver." Moreover, it hadn't been burned. This explanation didn't reassure anyone. On the contrary, it left the feeling that someone had fabricated evidence and then tried to bury it as evidence. Why? It was like a stone left in the middle of the question. Sometimes a wrong answer is more disturbing than no answer at all. Jenny said, "I wish such things didn't happen. What's happened to us is already enough." On the nights George went to the billboard, he would pull his car a little further away and turn off his headlights. Standing by the billboard, he would look into the children's eyes and whisper their names one by one. Maurice, ... Martha, ... Jenny, ... Betty. Once, a car slowed down beside the billboard, then sped up. George tried to note the license plate, but his eyes filled with tears, and the letters blurred on the wet glass. That night when he returned home, he told Jenny, "Someone is bothered." "By the board," Jenny said. "Not by the board, but by the questions it asks." Those questions continued to bleed somewhere in the town. Months later, a waiter at a restaurant insisted, "One of those kids ate here." He put the napkin in his pocket when he left the table. There was a name on it. The napkin had long since been thrown away. The name kept shifting between two different letters in the waiter's memory. Some witnesses looked away, saying, "I might be mistaken." Others swore, "I definitely saw it." Some details: the man's accent, the children's silence, the emptiness in their eyes resonated with each other. A detective once said, "1/3 of statements are fantasy. 1/3 leave room for doubt, and 1/3 hold value." George and Jenny were willing to knock on every door for even that 1/3 asterisk. The years accelerated the fading of the photos on the board. George replaced the photos and refreshed the text. The reward has been increased. A new line was added. Someone, late at night, left a small note under the board. "You are right, but you are dangerous." There was no signature on the note. The ink had run in the rain, leaving only a few words. Jenny asked herself, what is dangerous? It's being right, continuing to ask questions, or upsetting things. The answers to these questions varied slightly, and resembled each other a little in every car that passed in front of the board. One morning, the postman rang the doorbell. A small package appeared at the door. Inside was a brown envelope. Inside was another photograph. Is it the same young man, or a similar face? Jenny leaned under the lamp. In this new photograph, the young man's gaze was slightly more sideways. Behind his right shoulder, a blurry wall, a vaguely shaped poster, and 2 letters peeking out from the corner of the poster. Another short note on the back. "Love, Louis." Another string of numbers. Another elusive code. George pinned the photograph to the map next to the panel. In the edge of the map, he jotted down the numbers and letters. City, route, line number. Something seemed to connect, but a line was always missing. This photograph's postmark bore a distinct marking. It read the code for a postal center. George didn't prepare for someone else to go there. This time he prepared himself. "I'll go," he said. Jenny asked, "If you go and it gets dark?" George pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "I take notes in the dark," he said. Sometimes stubbornness is the only axis that keeps sadness afloat. George's stubbornness was sometimes a source of ridicule, sometimes of admiration in the town. A carpenter said, "The man is like a stone." Another asked, "Does a stone have a heart?" What was beating inside that stone were the children's names. Asterisk before we set off, another call came. It was just after midnight. The line crackled softly. "Are you Sodder?" a man's voice asked. "Yes," George said. "Who are you?" The voice gave an address. "Come on, we need to talk." George wrote the address down with his pen, repeated it, making sure it was correct. "Who are you?" After a silence, the line went dead. In the morning, George would drive to that address. That night, as he passed the billboard, he slowed. The grass beneath the billboard was wet. He turned off the headlights and tried to recall the children's features in the darkness. "I'm here," he said. "I won't let go." The darkness drew in the sentence. It remained. Around the same time, on the other side of town, another phone rang. Jenny picked up the receiver. There was a deep breath on the other end, then a low whisper, "Let go." The syllable dissolved into an unidentified hum. "Let go of who?" Jenny asked. "Let go of what?" There was no answer. When the line went dead, Jenny stood under the kitchen lamp and stared at her reflection. Leaving was the only word she wrote in her notebook at the kitchen table that night. She put 3 question marks next to it. The next morning, she tore out the page and put it in a drawer. Asterisk over the years. A watchman would say, "I saw 2 men bury a small coffin one night." A trainman would begin to recount, "A black car sped through town on Christmas Eve." The weight of the testimony shifted. Some days, it sounded very convincing. Others, it felt weird. George collected them all. Today, on the outskirts of town, on the dusty back shelf of a second-hand bookstore, he came across a report on the fire. A sentence like, "No burn." Marks found. The report was in another folder. Who had put it there? Why? "Paper sometimes hides the truth," said the second-hand bookstore. "Sometimes it just blurts it out." George's journey began the next morning. A small bag, a notebook, a pencil, a photograph. He turned off the car radio as he stepped out from the shadow of the billboard and onto the road. The trees along. The road soon began to resemble the same tree. Small towns, gas stations, the smell of cheap coffee. The city where the address was given appeared before him like a mist in the afternoon. George stopped in front of a motel. The desk clerk said. "Just 1 night, maybe 2, George said. His sleep was fitful that night. When he closed his eyes, the fading pictures on the billboard would recolor in his mind. When he opened, his eyes, the patterns on the motel wallpaper, would transform into picture frames. Asterisk the next day. He went to the given address, an ordinary apartment building, an ordinary dead-end street. The doorbell was broken. He knocked on the door. A voice from inside said, "Who is it?" "You asked to see me?" George said. The metal in the lock turned. The door opened a finger's width, then closed. A driver looked out the window. A curtain moved slightly. A dog barked, and then fell silent. George sat on the step opposite the door and waited. Waiting, when you look for long, becomes a kind of questioning. After a while, the door opened again. "Not now," said the same voice. "Let's meet under the billboard tonight." George made a note with his pen. The billboard. He thought to himself, the billboard again. There was no wind in the town that evening. The billboard simply continued to ask, just as it had for years. As George stepped closer to the billboard, there was a shadow. Undampened by the rain, a yellow envelope on the grass at the base of the billboard's post. No name, no address, just 1 word. Done. George bent down, picked up the envelope, and looked up. From the photographs on the dashboard, as if a pair of eyes were staring at him, he didn't open the envelope when he got in and opened the door. He noticed a car on the corner of the road opposite, its low beams off. He started the engine. The headlights came on. The envelope lay in his lap. Whatever was inside would either bind something or unbind it. As he fingered the envelope, only one thought crossed his mind. If that's the answer, what about the question itself? Asterisk. He didn't open the envelope right away. He turned the steering wheel and emerged from the shadows of the billboard. The night deepened quickly. A telephone booth appeared at the side of the road. Its window was as clear of fog. He stood in front of it, the envelope in his hand. At that moment, the phone rang. Not from inside the booth, but as if from right there on the billboard, from the darkness. For a moment, without knowing who was hearing it, George heard the deep voice that reached deep into his ear. Remember one thing? The sentence was cut short. The envelope remained unopened in George's hand. And that night, under the kitchen lamp, Jenny wrote simply this in her notebook. This matter isn't just what happened, it's what has been transformed into. He drew a line under the line. The line remained blank. Asterisk towards morning, Someone else came to the board. The envelope's mark was no longer in the grass, but a thin scratch had been made on the board's post, which the rain couldn't wash away. 2 small squares, one inside the other. When Jenny saw the sign the next day, she said, "I've seen this. Symbol somewhere, ... double quotes." Her sentence trailed off. Where? When? Her mind tried to grasp the background of a photograph, the edge of a frame, the metal of a door. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Jenny opened the door. Her threshold stood like a void that hadn't held anyone's footprints for years. In the middle of the threshold, a small note, the same color as the envelope beneath the board. There was no address on the note, just a place and time, board tonight, 12:15 a.m. And a single line beneath it, "Come alone." She glanced at her watch. She didn't turn off the kitchen light. She reached for the phone to reach George. The line was busy. Turning to the window, she saw something moving next to the board. Was it a shadow or a movement not made by the wind? As he held the note tighter in his palm, only one sentence rang in his mind. If we open the envelope, will we also open a door of no return? The night grew beneath the panel. As the years passed, the calendar pages became mere numbers for the Sodder family, for the clock inside them was always stuck on that night. Christmas 1945. George took the same route to work again and again, but with each return, the small hope of seeing the children's shoes on the doorstep was shattered again and again each evening. Every morning, Jenny poured water into 5 small cups at the kitchen table, then poured them one by one, as if to say, "Let someone stay thirsty." The profound silence that descended over the town, the neighbors avoiding glances, stopping, mid-sentence saying, "May God grant you patience," and closing the door soon became commonplace. It was the pain itself that became commonplace. For years, the large billboard George hung by the roadside stood as the town's conscience. Each time it was replaced, it saw thicker wood, sturdier nails, and brighter paint. But each time, the faces on it looked a little further away. "Have you seen them?" became first a question, then a summons, and finally a plea. Truck drivers downshifted in front of the dashboard. Some honked their horns, some bowed their heads, some got out and prayed. Others searched for their own reflection in the mirror. As soon as they got in, as if trying to push back a shadow that had caught their eye, Jenny compiled the temperature ranges, burn times, and crematorium reports of house fires in a notebook. At home in the corner of the kitchen, that notebook. Each page resembling the sleepless hours of a different night gradually became a research file. She underlined sentences like, "Bones don't disappear completely in a house fire" next. To them, a small cross, a small prayer sign. No bones, no trace, left the possibility of they never got out or they were. One night, as George was turning the pages of the notebook, he wrote a single word next to the word "got out." Why? The faint whispers that swirled around town around that why never quite disappeared. Some said George's political remarks. Others muttered, insurance, money, hostility. A few people claimed there was a black sedan in front of the house that evening. Another said, a man speaking Italian at the station gave the children a ride. These were all incomplete pieces, yet their incompleteness made the heartbreak even more gnawing. As the police closed the case, declaring there was no evidence, the family opened their own. The date, time, place, name all were relegated to the notebook. This was a family investigation that began where the official investigation ended. The first photograph. From the early 1950s, that strange frame with the note, "Louis Sodder, your brother loves you," attached to the back launched. A new trajectory within the family. Jenny said she saw her son's eyes when she looked at it. When George looked, he said there's a resemblance, but it could also be a trap. He hired a private investigator. The man left and disappeared. The detective's disappearance opened a new fissure in George's mind. There are those around this who prefer to remain silent. Professionals at that. "Whoever sent that photo knows the address," said a shopkeeper in town. "The post office stamp is partially obscured, but it's from out of town." Each partially obscured stamp hinted at a partially obscured truth. But for the stamps to become reality, someone had to come forward and say, "Yes, I sent it. No one did. As George grew older, his insistence hardened, but he never let his anger fade. His anger was a hard-working one, a rage that petitioned, waited in the archives, sought out samples. He wrote to the county, the state, and Washington, D.C., saying, "Open the file, re-examine the samples, record in the official record where." The line broke. Sometimes the answer came, limited resources, closed file, no new evidence. When no answer came, George added another small piece of cardboard next to his board. We expect an answer. Answers are sometimes a town's biggest debt. When they aren't paid, they grow with interest. In the mid-1960s, a rumor was resurrected. Lights were visible at night, at the mouths of the old mines on the edge of town. Young people are sneaking around drinking, they said.
Atch!
Treasure hunters. They said, then a whisper spread that something's being buried. George's knees weren't what they used to be when he was young, but he couldn't turn his back on that rumor. He went to the pits with his sons and 2 volunteers. The first day they found only rusty cans and old bottles. The second, a crushed hairpin. The third, the metal corner of a broken picture frame. On the fourth, under a depression in the ground, they came across a piece of wood, chest lid, that hadn't seen the sun. The wood was rotten. It crumbled and cracked when touched. Beneath the lid lay a mound of soil and shards of coal. Then a smell broke through the heavy silence within. One of the volunteers called out, "Careful," and put down the shovel. George knelt down, put on his gloves, and scattered the dirt with his fingertips. What he saw was the kind the mind at first rejects and desperately accepts: small, thin, fragile fragments of bones, small enough to belong to a child's hand, a child's foot. No one spoke, for there are moments when words diminish the truth. Asterisk officers, summoned from the district, cordoned off the area. Samples were packaged and sent to a laboratory. A sentence they had been waiting years for, but never wanted to hear, arrived at the family's home. First by phone, and then in an envelope. The remains found belonged to more than one child. The age ranges matched the ages of the 5 missing children. The report said match, not definitive, and a single line didn't fit, but not a single line completed. The legal jargon was cautious. The scientific jargon was cautious. Mother and father's words spoke only one word: they were found. As soon as news of the find spread around town, old phrases were repeated in new voices. Some said it was obvious from the start. Others whispered, "Someone took the children and then brought them back." Still others asked, "The furnace door had been open for years. Why now?" This why now question became the new key to the Sodder file. Because something had been hidden for years and then somehow emerged. Was this a coincidence or acquittal? Cleanup before road construction. Someone's conscience. The second report from the lab stated that there were no signs of burning. On the bones, it's clarified not the fire theory but the line between fire and burial. If these bones weren't destroyed in the fire, the children had either been pulled alive that night from the fire, or had been held elsewhere simultaneously with the fire, and then buried at some point. This time, the question why merged not only with who, but also with when. George wrote in his notebook, "Not through the door, but through the moment," a phrase he had quoted from a sheriff's deputy who had jotted it down in a report years earlier. Time is sometimes a more complex terrain than a town map. The metal hinges of the recovered trunk lid bore a hardware store stamp used in the town in the late 1940s. It was shown to a former mechanic, who said that model arrived at our warehouse. In 1947, this information sank into the margin of the report like a calendar pin. 1947, 2 years after the fire. Jenny said someone took something and put it somewhere back then. That someone, and that somewhere, the file's largest gaps were now surrounded by bones, rusty hinges, and rotten wood. The gaps sometimes became more visible as the surrounding details multiplied. One of the town's leaders wanted to speak to George after the find. "Drilling through the past," he said, "makes you tired." George replied, "It's not the digging through the past that tires me. It's the fact that someone has equated the past with the earth." The sentence remained between 2 men in a small room, but the same line appeared on both their faces, a line of silence. In small towns, Some things aren't talked about. They don't disappear because they aren't talked about. They only get heavier. After a while, another witness appeared. Years ago, on the night of the fire, she said she had driven past the house, seen a black sedan turning north, and seen moving shadows in the back seat. I didn't think of it as a child at the time, she said. I didn't want to think about it anyway. Confession is sometimes like a sentence one tells oneself. It's late, but the pain is still fresh. The witness's statement was transcribed, but now it was just a shadow next to the bones. The shadow points to the truth. It isn't. It did little more than give the family one more story. Jenny didn't speak for days after the discovery. Evenings she sat in front of the window in her black dress, staring at the photos on the board, wiping the fog from the glass with her fingertips. Then one evening, she laid out on the table old photos of the children, lab reports, photos of the hinges, the photo from the envelope with the word Louis, and a preliminary plan of the house. She touched each one individually. What do we do now? She asked herself. There was no answer. The lack of an answer became a sentence of fate. After the discovery, Jork petitioned the authorities once again, reopen the investigation. The answer was short and familiar. No new criminal activity. One evening, he stood by the billboard, silent for a long time. Then, beneath it, he added a new line. Is what silences us stronger than what we have discovered? This question cracked open a different door in the minds of everyone who passed by. Some said yes, others said no. But the real issue was the existence of that question. Everyone was now living with a question. Following the find, a small commemoration was held in the town. 5 candles were lit in a small space behind the church. People filed in, paused for a minute, and then quietly departed. An elderly man held his grandson's hand as they passed. The candles. Look, he said, this is what you call memory. The grandson looked up, then asked, but why? The old man paused and smiled. Sometimes a lifetime isn't enough to know why. This wasn't a consolation. It was a reality. The second photograph, which arrived in 1968, the one with the words, Love Louis written simply on the back, created a new rift when placed side by side with the find. If the bones belonged to the children, who was in the photo? If it really was Louis in the photo, to whom did the bones belong? Questions clashed. This time, the debate within the family wasn't between hope and the weight of truth, but between 2 different contenders for truth. Jenny looked at the photograph and said, my son. George looked at the metal hinges of the chest and said, they're buried. The family lived between 2 sentences. To outsiders, it was a contradiction. To those living inside, it was the only way to breathe. A few months after the find, county road maintenance crews stumbled upon an old layer of fill while patching the dirt outside town. 3 small metal buttons, the kind used on children's jackets from the 1940s, emerged from the dirt. Next to them were a small hair clip, its shine long since faded, and a piece of a wristwatch with a cracked glass. These weren't evidence on their own, but when placed alongside the bones, a picture emerged that, for the first time since that night, had become complete. The team leader handed over the findings to the family, along with a report. Jenny picked up the clip and said, Martha's hair would have liked this. The certainty in that sentence weighed more than the caution of the reports. George recited the children's names, one after another, alongside that clip, those buttons, that piece of watch. Then he pinned 3 more small photographs to a corner of his bulletin board, close-ups of the buttons, the clasp, the watch part. Beneath them he added a short sentence. The thing remains. He didn't say the rest. Everyone knew the owner is lost. The family requested that the bones be buried in a grave. In a small ceremony, their names were inscribed on each stone. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., Betty. They stood for a long time before the stones. The wind caressed them, the leaves of the trees rustled softly. Jenny's eyes saw nothing but the stone. Say their names out loud, he told George. George said the names. The hardest thing for a father is to greet and send off with a name. That's what George did that day. For a brief moment after the ceremony, the town was truly silent. Then, like everything else, routine swallowed this one up. Rices were discussed again in front of the grocery store, ball games played again on the way to school, and whispers began again in the churchyard. But this time, the whispers shared a common tone. They were found. The question who was missing from the whisper. A question when was now etched thickly in everyone's mind. The documents from government offices were put away in a drawer. On top of it sat a small note from Jenny. Questions that demand answers. At the top of the list was why. Immediately below were who and when. Finally, another short line. What silenced us? This last question was perhaps the true title of the file. For over the years, what this family had fought most was perhaps not a person, but a silence. Asterisk, asterisk, one morning, George considered taking down the bulletin board. Then he decided against it. Let the board stay, he said, because this story needs to stay written on the wall. Over the years, the board took on a new function. Everyone who passed by looked at it as if they were looking back at their own childhood. Some wondered, what would I have done? Others were afraid to ask themselves, how did the person who made this live all these years? Time fades the color of everything, but sometimes it writes a name darker, sharper. That's how the Sodder children's names remained in the town. This is one of the most difficult riddles in this country, a teacher said in class. A history club student wrote. Perhaps the answers weren't in the archives, but in people's consciences. Conscience is sometimes the most secret archive. It takes courage, not a key, to open it. Years later, as Jenny sat alone, the weight of never taking off her little black dress settled more on her heart than on her shoulders. She looked out the window and saw the faded writing on the board. Then she turned her head and opened the drawer. He laid out the lab reports, photos of hinges, pictures of buttons and buckles. And those famous 2 photographs, the ones with the word Louis written on the back one by one on the table. Can both be true at the same time, he murmured. Both here and there?
Oh.
The sentence was preposterous. But for someone who had accepted the preposterous for years, that no traces were left in a house fire, preposterous sentences were no longer so distant. The lines that entered the town records, the official history, the newspaper archives were cold. The remains found were buried. The investigation is closed, but stories enter the archives coldly. They live warmly on people's lips. Child in town stopped at the bulletin board on his way home from school and looked at the photographs. When he got home, he asked his parents, "Who is this?" The parents fell silent, then said, "It's a long story." Child pressed, "Can you tell me?" It was told. That night, the lights went out a little later in another house. Another story was carried into a child's mind. This is sometimes the only end justice can achieve, not being forgotten. The question, what if, ... that lingered on the lips, waiting for its final sentence, now pointed only to one thing. The remains of these children had been found, but who had placed them there, when, and why? Unless these 3 questions were answered, the town's nights would never truly darken. And one day, if another roadworks project, another archive box, another confession, another letter were to be unearthed, perhaps at least one of these 3 questions would be answered. But not today. Today. 5 stones stand in front of the small grave on the edge of town. 5 names are written on them. When the wind blows, the stones don't speak, but the voice that carries through the pine needles whispers something. This wasn't an ordinary fire. Then, when the wind subsides, only those old questions remain, and the faded inscription on the sign. Have you seen them? Sometimes Jenny looks out the window in the middle of the night, trying to make out the dark lines of the sign. She wipes the mist from the glass again, lists the names again. Then he turns off the light. In the darkness, he hears his own voice. They were found. There's no period at the end of this word. There are 3 periods. Because in some stories, not every ending is an ending, simply the beginning of a new silence. And that silence is sometimes larger than a town.